A family portrait is a promise. It is a declaration, captured in silver nitrate and light, that we are here. A bulwark against the chaos of the world, a testament to a shared life. But a photograph is also a ghost. A perfect moment, frozen in time, forever unaware of the future that is rushing towards it. Before the smoke, before the silence, before the billboard that would haunt the national highway for 30 years, there was this. There was a home. It stood in Fayetteville, West Virginia, a town built on coal and the quiet grit of the families who mined it. And in that home lived the Sodders. The patriarch Giorgio Sodder, an immigrant from Sardinia, Italy, had arrived in America with nothing but a name he would quickly anglicize to George Sodder. Through relentless work and a shrewd business mind, he built a successful trucking company from the ground up. He was a living embodiment of the immigrant dream. Outspoken, fiercely anti-Mussolini, and unyieldingly proud of the family he had built with his wife Jennie. It was a large, boisterous Italian-American family, 9 children in total, a house filled with a constant, chaotic symphony of life. On the evening of December 24th, 1945, that symphony was at its peak. The Second World War was over. Their eldest son was home from the service, and the house on the edge of town was an island of festive warmth against the cold Appalachian night. Marion, the eldest daughter, had played Santa Claus, surprising her younger sisters Martha, Jennie, and Betty with new toys she had bought from her job at a local dime store. The children, drunk on excitement and allowed to stay up late, played in a state of Christmas Eve bliss. Morris, Martha, Louie, Jennie, Betty, 5 children, their ages ranging from 14 down to 5. 5 distinct lives, burning bright in the warm glow of the family home. But outside that glow, the darkness was not empty. That evening, 2 dissonant notes were played, subtle cracks in the foundation of a perfect night. The first was a phone call. At around 10 p.m., the phone rang, an intrusion into the family's private world. It was a woman Jennie didn't know, asking for a name she didn't recognize. When Jennie politely informed her she had a wrong number, she could hear the caller's strange, mocking laugh in the background before the line went dead. Jennie would later recall the clinking of glasses, the sound of a party. A wrong number easily dismissed. And yet, it left a residue of unease. The second was a quiet observation, something noted but not fully processed until later. George Sodder had looked out his window to see a man standing by the main highway, watching his younger children play. He was a stranger, an anomaly in this small, familiar town. By midnight, the festivities began to wind down. 5 of the older children, Morris, Martha, Louie, Jennie, and Betty, begged to stay up a little later to play with their new toys. Their mother, Jennie, acquiesced on one condition. They had to remember to feed the cows and close the chicken coop before they went to bed. They promised they would. Jennie, George, and 4 of the other children, John, George Jr., Sylvia, and Marion, retired to their bedrooms. It was the last time Jennie would ever see 5 of her children alive. At approximately 1:30 a.m., Jennie was awakened by the smell of smoke. The house, their sturdy, timber-framed sanctuary, was on fire. George and Jennie screamed, scrambling to gather their children. They, along with John, George Jr., baby Sylvia, and Marion, fought their way through the blinding smoke and heat, escaping into the freezing Christmas morning air. And then, standing on the snow-dusted lawn, watching their world turn to ash, came the catastrophic realization. Morris, Martha, Louie, Jennie, Betty, 5 children were still inside. What followed was a cascade of impossibilities, a sequence of events so baffling it forever transformed a family tragedy into an enduring American mystery. George Sodder, in a fit of desperate, eternal instinct, raced to find his heavy ladder, the one he always kept leaned against the side of the house, so he could climb to his children's second-story bedroom window. It was gone. vanished. He then tried to drive one of his work trucks up to the house to use it as a makeshift scaffold. Neither of his trucks would start, despite having worked perfectly the day before. The phone line, they discovered, was dead. A neighbor had to race to a nearby tavern to call the fire department, which was located only 2.5 miles away. But inexplicably, the Fayetteville Fire Department, despite the urgency of 5 children trapped in a blaze, did not arrive until 8 a.m., 7 hours after the fire was first reported. 7 hours during which George and Jennie Sodder could do nothing but stand in the frozen dirt and watch their home. And they believed 5 of their children burned to the ground. By the time help arrived, the house was a smoking, smoldering pit of ash. In the cold light of Christmas Day, the official story began to take shape. A tragic accident caused by faulty wiring, the 5 children having perished in the intense blaze, their bodies incinerated completely. The chief of the fire department told the grieving Sodders that the fire had been hot enough to cremate the bodies, leaving nothing behind. A death certificate was issued. The case, it seemed, was closed. But for George and Jennie Sodder, the questions had just begun. Questions that would gnaw at the edges of the official story until it completely unraveled. Why couldn't they find a single bone fragment, a single tooth in the ash? Why was their ladder missing? And what about the man who was seen shortly after the fire began, stealing a block and tackle from their garage? The official story was written, but for George and Jennie Sodder, their search that would consume the rest of their lives had just begun. Join us for part 2 of Voices of Innocent, the billboard on Route 16. Grief is a landscape. For some, it is a valley of sorrow to be passed through. But for George and Jennie Sodder, grief became a territory to be excavated, a scene to be investigated. The official explanation that 5 of their children had been completely vaporized in a house fire, leaving not a single trace, was a conclusion their hearts, consumed their minds, refused to accept. Their first anchor of doubt was Jennie's own simple domestic knowledge. She had been a homemaker, familiar with the cycles of fire and food. She knew that when her family roasted chickens in their backyard pit, even after hours in intense heat, the bones always remained. The idea that the fire, which had left the home's appliances and tin roofing largely intact in the ash, could have generated the 2,000+ degrees of heat required for a full cremation, and sustained it for the necessary 2 hours, seemed utterly implausible. Then came the testimony of the man who drove the bus. On Christmas morning, as the Sodder home still smoldered, he claimed to have seen the children. He told George Sodder he had witnessed them peering out at him from the window of a passing car as he drove his route. And there was the woman at a Charleston hotel who swore she had seen the children in the company of 2 men and 2 women of Italian extraction. She said the group seemed secretive, hostile, and refused to let the children interact with anyone. Fueled by these flickers of hope and doubt, George Sodder began his own investigation. He started to pull at the threads of the official narrative. The fire chief's claim of faulty wiring was the first to unravel. George had just had the entire house rewired, a fact he personally showed the fire chief, pointing out the still intact main fuse box. More chillingly, the telephone repairman who came to fix their line confirmed what George already suspected. The line hadn't been burned through. It had been cleanly cut. And there was the mystery of the missing ladder. It was discovered days later, inexplicably thrown into a steep embankment over 75 feet away from the house. A heavy, cumbersome object, not something a person could move casually. This, combined with the discovery that one of his trucks had been tampered with, suggested a coordinated, deliberate effort to prevent any rescue attempt from the outside. George began to systematically search the ruins himself. He started by bulldozing 5 feet of dirt over the site, preserving it as a sacred memorial to his lost children. It was in the ensuing months, combing through the perimeter, that Jennie found a small, hard, dark green rubber object. The family would later identify it as a handheld incendiary device, a pineapple bomb. This suggested the fire wasn't an accident. It was an attack. Armed with this growing mountain of anomalies, George approached the local authorities, pleading with them to reopen the case. He was met with indifference and what felt like a deliberate stonewalling. This rejection solidified George Sodder's conviction. If the law wouldn't search for his children, he would. He hired a private investigator from a neighboring town, a man named C.C. Tinsley. It was Tinsley who unearthed one of the story's darkest and most insidious threads. He discovered a rumor that the Fayetteville fire chief, the same man who was so slow to respond and so quick to declare the children dead, had a secret. He had allegedly found a child's heart in the ashes of the home. According to the rumor, he concealed this discovery, burying the heart in a metal box to hide it from the Sodders. A confession of a cover-up, or a cruel town rumor designed to inflict more pain. George and Tinsley decided to force the issue. In August of 1949, nearly 4 years after the fire, they conducted their own excavation of the basement. They sifted through the dirt where the fire chief had supposedly buried the box, and they found it. But inside was not a heart. It was beef liver, untouched by the fire. The immediate conclusion was horrifying. The liver had been planted there, a deliberate deception to make the Sodders believe their children were truly dead and finally abandon their search. The question was, who would do such a thing, and why? But the excavation yielded something else, something far more profound. After meticulously sifting the earth, the team found a few small bone-like fragments. They were sent to the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. for analysis. The official report was a bombshell. The fragments were indeed human vertebrae. They belonged to a single individual whose age was estimated to be between 16 and 22. Crucially, the bones showed no signs of exposure to fire, and not one of the missing Sodder children was older than 14. The bones didn't belong to his children. Who then was this unidentified person, and what did their remains mean? Had there been another body in the house, a secret victim, or was this evidence planted as yet another, more sophisticated deception? For George and Jennie Sodder, the Smithsonian report was the final confirmation. Their children had not died in the fire. They were alive. They had been taken. Their quest, once a private investigation, now became a public declaration. In 1952, at the very spot where their home once stood, they erected a billboard. It featured the faces of their 5 missing children, offering a reward for information. It would become a mournful landmark on Route 16, a testament to a family's unbreakable hope, and a silent rebuke to the official story that had long been closed. The Sodders had stopped waiting for answers. They were now broadcasting their questions to the entire world. The billboard stood as a beacon, and one day, nearly 20 years after the fire, it would receive a single, cryptic, and electrifying response. A single photograph that would both vindicate their belief and plunge them into an even deeper mystery. Join us for Part 3 of Voices of Innocent, The Man in the Photograph. A question asked long enough can become a kind of landmark. For over 30 years, the Sodder billboard stood watch over Route 16. It became part of the landscape, a local legend, a piece of American Gothic folklore. For travelers, it was a chilling roadside curiosity. For George and Jennie Sodder, it was a lighthouse, its beam cutting through the fog of time, a constant silent call sent out to their lost children. Their lives settled into a new, strange rhythm, a life lived in parallel. In one reality, they raised their surviving children, celebrated birthdays, attended weddings. But in their private, second reality, they were a family frozen in time, forever waiting for 5 of their children to come home. They never rebuilt the house. Instead, Jennie cultivated a vast and beautiful memorial garden at the site, a vibrant testament of life in a place defined by loss. She wore black for the rest of her life, a quiet, constant statement of mourning, not for the dead, but for the missing. George, meanwhile, channeled his grief into action. He followed every lead, no matter how faint or fantastical. He traveled across the country to investigate sightings, wrote countless letters to the FBI, who repeatedly insisted it was a local matter outside their jurisdiction, and offered a reward that grew with each passing year. Their search drew national attention, a heartbreaking human interest story that periodically surfaced in magazines and newspapers, always ending with the same haunting question. And with that national attention came the letters, hundreds of them. Letters of support, letters from psychics, letters offering crackpot theories. But among them, two emerged that were so specific, so chillingly detailed, that they couldn't be ignored. The first was a letter from a woman in St. Louis. She claimed that Martha, the eldest missing daughter, was living in a convent there. The Sodders immediately pursued the lead. George spoke to the Mother Superior, but his request to see the young woman was denied. The lead, like all the others, dissolved into a frustrating dead end. A case of mistaken identity? Or a door deliberately closed? The second came from someone who claimed to have known a man who participated in the children as abduction. The letter writer alleged that the Sodder children were alive and well, living in Florida. They claimed the fire was an act of retaliation against George Sodder for his loud, public criticisms of Benito Mussolini and the fascist government in his native Italy. This theory resonated deeply with George. He had always been an outspoken anti-fascist, a fact which had led to heated arguments within Fayetteville's close-knit Italian immigrant community. It suggested a motive far more sinister than a simple accident. Was the fire a politically motivated act of terror? A warning from the local Sicilian mafia, which was known to operate in the region? Had his children been taken, perhaps back to Italy, to silence him? The theory was explosive, but it was also impossible to prove. The FBI, once again, refused to get involved, classifying it as a local vendetta. George was on his own. And then, after 22 years of silence, it arrived. In 1967, a letter was sent to the Sodder home, postmarked from Central City, Kentucky. There was no return address. Inside, there was no letter. There was only a single photograph. It was a picture of a young man in his late 20s, with dark curly hair and dark, intense eyes. He bore a striking, undeniable resemblance to their son, Louis, who would have been in his early 30s at the time. On the back of the photograph, a cryptic handwritten message was scrawled. It read, "Louis Sodder, I love Brother Frankie, you little boys." A 90132 or 35. The message was a chilling enigma. The Sodders had a son named John, not Frankie. What was the meaning of "ill boys"? Was it a typo? A code? And the numbers, were they a zip code? A military ID? An address? It was the single most concrete piece of evidence they had ever received. It was a message from the void. Overjoyed and terrified, the Sodders hired another private investigator, this time to track down the man in the photograph. The investigator traveled to Kentucky, but his search came up empty. He was never seen nor heard from again by the family. The Sodders, fearing that another hired hand had met with foul play or been bought off, decided to protect the one clue they had left. They amended their billboard, adding the new photograph of the man they believed was their son Louis, and placed the original photograph in a frame above their fireplace. A new beacon of hope, a new face for their unending search. The photograph became the family's new obsession. Was it a cruel, elaborate hoax, designed by someone who knew their story intimately? Or was it what they desperately wanted it to be? The first real communication from one of their lost children? A cryptic message sent from a life they could not imagine? The photo deepened the mystery, confirming their belief that the children were alive, while simultaneously highlighting the impossible gulf that lay between them. George Sodder would go to his grave in 1969, his life's greatest question unanswered. His family remembered him walking the property line at night, carrying a flashlight, still searching until the very end. Jennie, the matriarch, the keeper of the garden, would continue the vigil until her death in 1989. She remained in the same house, never changing the furniture, a silent vigil in case one of her lost children ever found their way home. With Jennie's passing, the remaining children finally took the billboard down. The family's public declaration had ended. The story, it seemed, would fade into the realm of Appalachian folklore. But the search was not over. The flame of hope, nurtured for a lifetime by George and Jennie, had been passed down to their surviving children and then to their grandchildren. They had a new and powerful ally their parents could only have dreamed of. Science was ready to re-examine the coldest clues. Join us for the final part of Voices of Innocent, Echoes in the Ash. A story does not end when its main characters leave the stage. It lives on, an echo passed down through a family, a mystery inherited. After the deaths of George and Jennie Sodder, the search for the 5 missing children did not cease. The great public declaration of the billboard was gone, but the private burning question was bequeathed to the next generation. The surviving children, now adults with families of their own, and then their children took up the torch. The youngest Sodder child, Sylvia, was just 2 years old on the night of the fire. She grew up in the shadow of an impossible absence, her life defined by the faces of 5 siblings she could never truly remember. For her, and for her generation, the mystery was not just a family tragedy. It was a core part of their identity. They became the archivists of their own history, the keepers of every letter, every photograph, every tantalizing dead-end clue. And with the dawn of a new century came new tools, not of investigation, but of analysis. The internet allowed amateur sleuths and a new generation of cold case enthusiasts to connect, to share files, to scrutinize the known facts of the Sodder case from 1,000 different angles. It is this modern lens that has cast the deepest shadows of doubt on the official 1945 explanation. Professional fire investigators, looking at the case today, are almost unanimous in their skepticism. The complete incineration of 5 bodies, with no bone fragments left behind, in a standard 45-minute house fire, is considered a virtual impossibility outside of a controlled, high-temperature crematorium. A fire chief's initial, definitive statement, which effectively shut down the investigation before it began, now seems less like a professional opinion and more like a deliberate act of misdirection. And what of the photograph? The cryptic message from Louis Sodder. Modern analysis has only deepened its enigma. The handwriting has never been matched. The strange numbers and letters, a 9013, 2, or 35, have been run through every conceivable database, from military serial numbers to prison records, with no result. Was it a code that has lost its key? A cruel hoaxer's random scribblings? Or was it, as the Sodder family has always believed, a desperate, flawed attempt by a long-lost son to make contact? Then there are the bones. The Smithsonian confirmed human vertebrae that proved 2 things. They were not exposed to fire, and they did not belong to any of the missing children. Decades of speculation have circled these fragments. Were they planted by the abductors to mislead the investigation? Or do they hint at an even darker, more complex crime, an unknown adult victim, buried in the basement long before the fire, whose grave was disturbed by George Sodder's bulldozer? The bones are a fact, a hard piece of physical proof that the official story is not just incomplete. It is fundamentally wrong. Today, the case of the Sodder children remains officially unsolved. There are 2 primary schools of thought. The first, and most widely believed by the family and modern researchers, is the abduction theory that the fire was a deliberately set diversion, a cover for a kidnapping, likely motivated by a vendetta against the outspoken George Sodder. In this version, the children were whisked away into the night, possibly raised under new names, living lives their family could never know. The second theory is darker still. It posits that the children did, in fact, die that night, not in the fire, but perhaps before it, through some other nefarious act, and that the fire was set to cover up that crime, with the orchestrators possessing enough local influence to ensure the official investigation was shut down quickly and incompetently. What we are left with is an echo chamber of unanswered questions, a void where 5 lives should have been. The story of the Sodder children is a testament to the fact that sometimes the absence of evidence is itself a kind of evidence. The absence of remains, the absence of a proper investigation, the absence of any confession or resolution. It is also a story about the extraordinary power of hope. For George and Jennie Sodder, to believe their children were alive was an act of profound faith, a lifelong vigil against the darkness of uncertainty. Perhaps in the end, it did not matter if they were right. What mattered was that they never stopped searching. They refused to let their children be erased, refused to let their memory turn to ash and smoke. And in doing so, they etched their family's story into the heart of American mystery, ensuring their 5 lost children would never, ever be forgotten. Forgetting is the final injustice. We choose to remember. If you believe justice, join us with subscribe and like to our channel Voices of Innocent. We are wanting your opinion in comments.